Yes, the Q4 projections look promising. Acquire.
Acquire.
Excellent. Ensure the team moves on it immediately. Confirming the details. Looks good. Done.
The terms outline the transfer of all assets to Carter Developments, including the Manhattan property.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any further questions regarding the acquisition?
The transfer is confirmed, Mr. Sterling.
Verified.
Congratulations, Miss Carter.
Thank you.
You don't belong here. That was the first thing Olivia Carter heard when she stepped out of the elevator that morning. Not because it was said directly to her face at first, but because it was whispered just loud enough for her to feel it in her chest. The building in downtown New York was old but still carried a kind of expensive silence, the kind that made every footstep sound like a judgment. Olivia adjusted the strap of her simple shoulder bag and continued walking down the hallway toward her apartment. Unit 4B, the one place she could afford after everything in her life had changed. She kept her expression calm, the way she always did, even when Ethan Blake leaned casually against the wall near the stairwell with two of his friends. Ethan was the kind of person who never raised his voice because he never needed to. People listened anyway. His eyes scanned Olivia quickly, then lingered for a second too long on her worn shoes and the plain keychain she held. Still living like that? One of his friends muttered, half laughing, and Olivia heard it clearly enough to know it was meant for her. She didn't respond. Instead, she unlocked her door with a steady hand and stepped inside her small apartment, where the light from a single window fell across a modest living space that most people would have called forgettable. But what no one in that building understood was that Olivia never measured her life by what others saw. Inside that quiet room, she placed her bag down and opened her laptop, the screen lighting up with numbers, charts, and documents that told a very different story from the one Ethan and the others believed. A soft notification chimed on her phone, an encrypted message from a financial advisor confirming a scheduled review for a major property acquisition. Olivia read it without emotion, then closed the message and looked around her apartment as if seeing it for the first time. To anyone else, this was a place of limitation, but to her, it was simply temporary. Down the hall, Ethan's laughter echoed faintly through the walls, followed by another careless remark about people who never move up in life. Olivia slowly turned her gaze back to her screen, where a file labeled Harrison Cole Holdings, Confidential, remained open. The building she was sitting in, the same building where she was being quietly dismissed every day, was already part of a larger plan no one here had even begun to imagine. And in that moment, as the city outside continued its endless noise, Olivia Carter made a silent decision that would soon change the meaning of every word spoken about her in that hallway. The following morning arrived with the kind of quiet tension that only old buildings seem to carry, where every hallway feels like it remembers more than the people living in it. Olivia Carter left her apartment just after 7:30 in the morning, holding a simple coffee cup from a nearby cafe, and walking with the same steady pace she always used when she did not want to draw attention. The elevator doors opened slowly, revealing Ethan Blake already inside, checking something on his phone with a relaxed expression that suggested he owned not just the building, but the entire atmosphere around it. He glanced up as she stepped in, and for a brief moment his eyes paused on her before he offered a half-smile that did not reach any sense of warmth. "Early start for someone with nowhere important to be," he said casually, as if the words were harmless conversation rather than judgment. Olivia did not respond. She simply pressed the button for the lobby and stood still, her reflection faint in the polished metal doors. Behind them, two other residents joined on the next floor, and the space quickly filled with small talk about rising maintenance fees and rumors of a property sale. That last phrase shifted something subtle in Olivia's attention, though she gave no outward reaction. At the lobby, the group split in different directions, but Ethan lingered near the exit, continuing to speak loudly enough for others to hear that some people were simply meant to rent, not to own. Olivia walked past him without stopping, stepping out into the morning air where the city traffic already formed its usual rhythm. She crossed the street and entered a small cafe 2 blocks away, choosing a corner seat where she could see the entrance, but remain unnoticed. There, She opened her laptop again, and this time the screen displayed structured documents tied to legal entities, property valuation reports, and acquisition timelines connected to Harrison Coal Holdings. A soft notification appeared on the upper corner of the screen, confirming that the scheduled review meeting for the building acquisition had been moved up by 48 hours due to a seller urgency notice. Olivia took a slow sip of coffee as she read it, her expression unchanged, but her focus narrowing. The building she had just left was no longer just a place she lived in. It was a transaction entering its final stage. Meanwhile, back at the property, Ethan stood near the entrance talking with another resident about how people like Olivia would never understand real ownership or financial leverage. He laughed lightly as he said it, unaware that the conversation was being interrupted in ways he could not yet perceive. Inside Olivia's laptop, a secure confirmation email arrived stating that her authorization as a purchasing representative had been officially verified, granting her legal presence in the upcoming private acquisition meeting. She closed the laptop slowly, placed it back into her bag, and looked out the cafe window toward the skyline where the building stood only a few streets away. The city moved on as it always did, unaware that within the next decision window, the structure of everything she had been underestimated for was about to shift in a way no one in that building would be able to ignore. By midday, the city had shifted into its busiest rhythm, but inside the old downtown building, the atmosphere felt unusually unsettled, as if something invisible was beginning to reorganize the balance of control. Olivia Carter returned to the property just before noon, walking through the front entrance with a calm expression that revealed nothing of her intention. The lobby receptionist greeted her politely, still unaware of any change, and Olivia simply nodded before taking the stairs instead of the elevator. On the third-floor landing, she paused briefly, observing the familiar hallway where residents often gathered for casual complaints and daily conversations. Ethan Blake was there again, leaning near the bulletin board with a coffee in his hand, speaking with two other residents about rising rent expectations and how certain tenants were just background noise in better buildings. When he noticed Olivia approaching, his tone shifted slightly into something more performative, as if her presence provided an audience for his commentary. "You are still here?" he asked, smiling faintly. Olivia stopped for a moment but did not engage. Instead, she continued walking toward her apartment, though this time her attention was not on the hallway but on the subtle details around it, including the posted notices about property valuation updates and an upcoming official meeting scheduled by the building management company. Inside her apartment, she placed her bag down and opened her laptop again, where a secure dashboard displayed real-time updates tied to the property acquisition process. A new alert appeared indicating that Harrison Coal Holdings had finalized preliminary internal approval for a full asset transfer evaluation, and that external representatives would be present at a private meeting scheduled for the following morning. Olivia reviewed the document carefully, then opened a separate encrypted folder containing ownership verification certificates and legal authorization forms linked to her name through a corporate trust structure. Everything was aligned exactly as planned, with each layer of ownership hidden behind standard institutional structures that no casual observer in the building would ever question. Outside her door, faint voices echoed through the hallway as residents continued discussing rumors of a potential sale, though none of them had accurate information about timing or control. Ethan's voice stood out again, confident and dismissive, as he explained that people like Olivia would never be involved in anything beyond basic renting arrangements. Meanwhile, Olivia closed her laptop and sat quietly for a moment, listening to the building itself, the subtle sounds of movement, doors opening and closing, footsteps passing by her door without awareness of what was approaching. Her phone vibrated with a short confirmation message stating that her legal representative status for the upcoming acquisition meeting had been reconfirmed and that final attendance access had been approved without restriction. She read it once, then placed the phone face down on the table. At that same moment, Ethan and the other residents began receiving informal notices about a mandatory property briefing scheduled for the next morning, though no names of involved parties were disclosed. In the hallway, speculation began to spread quickly, with conversations turning uncertain as people tried to interpret what the announcement meant. Olivia remained in her apartment, still and composed, as the structure of the situation outside her door began to shift in ways that none of the voices in the hallway could yet fully understand. The next morning arrived with a quiet heaviness in the air, the kind that made even ordinary routines feel like they were part of something larger and unavoidable. Olivia Carter woke earlier than usual, and sat for a few moments in silence before preparing for the day ahead. She dressed simply, choosing neutral colors that drew no attention, then placed her laptop into her bag along with a thin folder containing printed documents that had been prepared the night before. At exactly 8:15 in the morning, she left her apartment and walked down the hallway of the building, noticing for the first time how many doors seemed slightly more active than usual, with faint sounds of movement behind them and people preparing for something they did not fully understand. In the lobby, a small group of residents had already gathered, discussing the mandatory briefing that had been scheduled without detailed explanation. Ethan Blake stood near the entrance, speaking confidently as always, suggesting that the meeting was likely about maintenance restructuring or minor ownership adjustments that would not affect people like them. When he saw Olivia, he gave a brief nod followed by a faint smile that carried the same dismissive familiarity as before. "Looks like everyone is suddenly important today," he said casually, as if the situation was nothing more than an inconvenience. Olivia did not respond. She simply continued toward the exit, then paused for a moment outside the building, looking up at its exterior as sunlight reflected off the older stone facade. Inside, the lobby continued to fill as more residents arrived, each carrying small expectations of routine explanations. At 9:45, a black vehicle arrived at the front entrance, and two individuals in professional attire stepped out, carrying briefcases and identification badges. The atmosphere inside the lobby shifted slightly as conversations quieted and attention began to focus toward the entrance. Ethan straightened his posture, observing with curiosity but still maintaining his confident tone, as he whispered to another resident that these were likely just administrative representatives handling routine matters. Olivia returned to the building just as the visitors entered the lobby, moving calmly through the crowd without hesitation. The receptionist greeted the arriving representatives and guided them toward the private conference room on the second floor, where the meeting was scheduled to take place. As residents were invited to gather in the designated space, a subtle tension began to build, not from fear but from uncertainty, as no one had been given clear details about what would be discussed. Ethan took a seat near the front, still speaking quietly to others about expected rent adjustments and property updates. Olivia entered last, choosing a seat slightly apart from the main group, placing her folder on the table in front of her without drawing attention. The room slowly settled into silence as the representatives prepared their materials, and a projection screen at the front of the room lit up with structured financial documentation related to ownership transfer, asset consolidation, and final acquisition approval. At that moment, the tone of the room began to shift, though most residents had not yet fully processed what they were seeing. Ethan leaned slightly forward, narrowing his eyes at the display, still assuming it was part of a standard briefing process. Olivia remained still, her gaze fixed on the front of the room as the final stage of a plan that had been invisible to everyone else was about to be formally presented in a way that could no longer be misinterpreted. The conference room remained unusually quiet as the projection screen stabilized, displaying structured documents that no longer looked like routine updates but instead carried the weight of formal financial authority. Olivia Carter sat calmly in her seat, hands resting lightly on the folder in front of her, while the other residents shifted slightly as they tried to interpret what they were seeing. Ethan Blake leaned forward with a faint expression of impatience, still assuming this was a procedural presentation that would eventually confirm minor adjustments or administrative changes. One of the representatives at the front of the room adjusted the microphone and began speaking in a steady professional tone, explaining that the meeting was not about maintenance fees or rental adjustments, but about a complete asset acquisition that had been finalized through a private investment structure. The words settled into the room slowly, as if the meaning required time to be understood. A few residents exchanged confused looks, while others glanced toward the projected documents showing legal ownership transfers and corporate filings. Ethan's expression changed slightly, though he still appeared confident as he whispered to the person beside him that large properties often went through restructuring without affecting tenant status. The representative continued, stating that the building had been fully acquired by a holding entity under a structured investment trust, and that all previous ownership agreements had been legally transferred with immediate effect. At that moment, Olivia opened her folder and placed a single document on the table in front of her, sliding it forward with quiet precision. It was an authorization certificate confirming her role as the designated representative of the purchasing entity responsible for the acquisition. The room shifted again, this time with a more noticeable silence as attention gradually moved toward her position. Ethan noticed the document and frowned, slightly, leaning back as his earlier confidence began to lose its ease. The representative acknowledged the document on the screen, confirming that Olivia Carter was officially registered as the authorized acquisition agent present for final execution procedures. The explanation continued, detailing how the acquisition included full operational control of the building, including tenant agreements, lease structures, and administrative oversight responsibilities. As the words were spoken, the realization began to spread across the room in uneven waves, with some residents beginning to understand the implications, while others still struggled to process them. Ethan slowly turned his head toward Olivia, studying her more carefully now, as if seeing her for the first time beyond the assumptions he had carried. The representative concluded by stating that effective immediately, the building's ownership structure had changed, and all prior and formal assumptions about authority within the property were no longer valid. Olivia remained still, her expression unchanged, as the final sentence settled into the room like a quiet closing statement. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain, but fully aware that the structure everyone had taken for granted had already shifted beneath them. The silence in the conference room stretched longer than anyone expected, not because anything else needed to be said, but because the weight of what had already been revealed was still settling into understanding. Olivia Carter remained seated, calm and composed, her hands still resting on the folder that now carried a different kind of meaning for everyone in the room. Ethan Blake had stopped speaking entirely. His earlier confidence had faded into a quiet stillness as he stared at the front screen, then briefly at the document placed on the table, then back at Olivia as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer matched. One version of her had been the neighbor he dismissed without thought, and the other was now tied directly to legal ownership authority over the building itself. The representative at the front of the room continued speaking, now clarifying procedural details regarding tenant communication, operational transition, and the immediate acknowledgement of new ownership structure. Each sentence reinforced the same reality in different forms, leaving less and less room for interpretation. A few residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at each other as the implications became clearer. Some lowered their eyes toward the table, while others focused on the screen as though it might offer a version of events that felt more familiar. Ethan finally leaned back, his expression no longer confident, but measured in a way that suggested he was recalculating every assumption he had made over the past weeks. The representative then formally confirmed Olivia Carter as the authorized presence representing the acquiring entity, stating that all final documentation had been validated and that her role was active and binding within the scope of the acquisition. Olivia gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without adding any additional reaction. The room remained still as the explanation moved toward final procedural instructions, including how communication regarding leases, maintenance, and building administration would now be centralized through the new ownership structure. Ethan's gaze returned to Olivia again, this time no longer casual or dismissive, but searching for something he had previously ignored. The realization was no longer abstract. It was present in every detail of the room, from the documents on the screen to the tone of the representative's voice. A resident near the back quietly asked for clarification about whether existing leases would remain unchanged, and the representative confirmed that terms would be reviewed under the new ownership framework but maintained according to legal standards. That single sentence brought a new layer of tension into the room, not because it threatened anyone directly, but because it redefined the assumptions they had built their daily lives on. Olivia finally closed her folder slowly, the sound barely noticeable, and stood up from her seat. As she did, the attention in the room subtly followed her movement without anyone needing to be told to look. She adjusted her bag, looked briefly toward the front of the room, then toward the residents who were still processing the situation in silence. Ethan remained seated, no longer speaking, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that the structure he had relied on socially within the building no longer held the same meaning. Olivia turned and walked toward the exit of the conference room with steady steps, leaving behind a room that had fully transitioned from assumption to understanding. As the door closed behind her, the building itself no longer felt like a place where she was being judged, but a place that had already been quietly redefined by decisions no one had seen coming until it was too late to interpret them any other way. After Olivia Carter left the conference room, the building felt noticeably different, not because anything physical had changed in that exact moment, but because the awareness of what had just been confirmed was now spreading through every corridor and conversation. She walked down the hallway on the second floor at a steady pace, passing by groups of residents who were no longer speaking casually, but instead in lower tones filled with uncertainty and recalculation. Ethan Blake was still inside the conference room when she exited, remaining seated as others slowly began to stand and leave, each person carrying their own interpretation of what had just been revealed. Some residents looked toward Olivia as she passed through the hallway, but she did not stop or acknowledge any of them, continuing forward with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the entire process. The reception area was now busier than earlier in the morning, with staff members receiving updated instructions from the representatives who had conducted the briefing. A printed notice was being placed near the entrance desk, indicating that all official communication regarding the building would now be centralized through a newly assigned management channel under the acquiring entity. Olivia paused briefly near the exit of the building, not to observe the reactions behind her, but to review a message on her phone, confirming the next phase of the ownership transition schedule. The message outlined administrative onboarding procedures, tenant communication protocols, and a timeline for structural review meetings over the coming days. She read it once, then locked her phone and placed it back into her bag. Behind her, Ethan finally emerged from the conference room along with the other residents. His expression was no longer confident or dismissive, but instead quiet and unsettled as he observed the updated notices being posted in real time. One of the residents asked him a question about what would happen to existing rent agreements, but he did not answer immediately, as if the question itself no longer had a simple response. Olivia stepped outside into the street where the sound of traffic returned to its normal rhythm, contrasting sharply with the stillness that had filled the building moments earlier. She stood for a brief moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the structure that had once represented a fixed and unchanging part of her daily life. Now, however, it stood under a different context entirely, one that no longer placed her within it as an unnoticed resident, but as part of the authority that defined its future. Inside the building, conversations continued to unfold in fragmented pieces, with residents attempting to interpret what ownership transition meant for their daily routines, their leases, and their assumptions about stability. Ethan remained near the entrance, now silent, watching as Olivia walked away from the building without urgency, as if the outcome of the meeting had not disrupted her direction at all, but had instead clarified it. As she continued down the sidewalk, the morning sunlight reflected off the windows of the building behind her, marking the end of one structure of understanding and the beginning of another that no longer relied on the assumptions that had defined it before. Later that afternoon, the building no longer carried the same casual energy it had just one day earlier, as every hallway now felt like a space under quiet review rather than routine living. Olivia Carter returned briefly to the property, not as a resident moving through familiar space, but as someone now involved in the structured transition process that was unfolding across multiple administrative layers. She entered through the main lobby where staff members were actively organizing updated documentation and directing residents toward official information notices. The receptionist greeted her with noticeable formality, holding a printed folder labeled with the new management instructions. Ethan Blake was standing near the seating area, no longer surrounded by his usual small group, instead observing the activity with a subdued expression that suggested he was still processing the shift in authority dynamics. When he noticed Olivia, he did not immediately speak, breaking from his previous pattern of casual remarks. Olivia approached the reception desk and received a sealed envelope containing formal onboarding information for the building's new operational structure, including contact protocols, tenant communication channels, and scheduled review timelines for property governance procedures. She acknowledged it briefly, then turned slightly as Ethan finally stepped closer. For a moment, he appeared as if he wanted to say something familiar or dismissive, but the words did not come out in the same way as before. Instead, his tone was lower and more measured when he finally spoke, asking whether the transition would affect day-to-day living arrangements for long-term residents. Olivia looked at him calmly, maintaining the same composed expression she had carried throughout the entire process, and responded only that all existing agreements would be reviewed according to formal structure rather than informal assumption. The answer was neutral, but its weight was clear enough that Ethan did not follow up. Around them, residents continued to move in and out of the lobby, collecting notices and asking questions that staff could only partially answer at that stage of transition. The building itself felt like it was in a state of organized recalibration, where every familiar routine was being redefined through formal procedures rather than casual understanding. Olivia placed the envelope into her bag and prepared to leave. Again, but paused for a moment at the entrance as she observed the flow of people inside the lobby. Ethan remained near the seating area, no longer projecting confidence or social control, but instead standing quietly as one of many residents adjusting to a changed framework. When Olivia finally stepped outside, she did not look back immediately, instead walking forward into the street, where the city continued its normal pace without awareness of the internal shift that had just taken place inside the building behind her. As she moved further away, the contrast between perception and reality became more defined, with one version of the building still existing in memory as a place of casual judgment, while the other had already transitioned into a structured environment defined by formal ownership and controlled authority. The moment marked a clear separation between what had been assumed and what had already been established, even if not everyone inside the building had fully accepted it yet. In the days that followed, the building settled into a new rhythm that no longer revolved around assumptions or informal social hierarchy, but instead operated under structured communication and formal oversight that gradually replaced uncertainty with defined process. Olivia Carter was no longer seen as just another resident moving quietly through the hallways, even though she continued to behave with the same calm and unassuming presence as before. Her involvement in the acquisition process remained largely administrative in appearance, yet its implications had already reshaped how people interacted within the space. Ethan Blake, once confident in his social standing within the building, had become noticeably quieter in shared areas, often limiting his conversations and observing rather than leading them. When he did speak, his tone was no longer dismissive, but cautious, as if every sentence now required consideration beyond personal opinion. Residents who previously engaged in casual judgment or assumptions about others began to adjust their behavior, not out of fear, but out of a growing awareness that the structure they operated within was no longer informal or stable in the way they had believed. Olivia continued to receive periodic updates related to the transition process, including confirmations of tenant communication schedules, maintenance system reviews, and administrative restructuring timelines. She reviewed each message briefly before moving on with her day, maintaining distance from unnecessary attention while remaining fully aligned with the formal responsibilities assigned to her role. One afternoon, she returned to the building briefly to attend a scheduled internal coordination meeting with the management representatives who were overseeing the transition. The lobby was noticeably more organized, with updated signage and designated information points replacing the earlier confusion that had characterized the first announcement. Ethan was present near the seating area when she arrived, but he did not approach immediately. Instead, he watched as Olivia spoke briefly with the representatives, exchanging structured updates regarding operational continuity and resident communication procedures. When their eyes briefly crossed, there was no confrontation or tension, only a recognition that the dynamic between them had permanently changed. After the meeting concluded, Olivia exited the conference area and walked toward the lobby, where a small group of residents had gathered to receive final clarification regarding lease continuity and building management structure. The representative confirmed that all agreements would remain legally valid under the new ownership framework, though all communication and administrative authority would now flow through the designated management channel established by the acquiring entity. Ethan stood slightly apart from the group, no longer attempting to interpret the situation through casual assumptions. Instead, he listened quietly, absorbing the formal clarity that replaced earlier speculation. When Olivia prepared to leave, she did so without announcement, walking past the group and toward the exit with the same steady pace she had always maintained. This time, however, no one interpreted her movement as ordinary, because the context around her presence had fundamentally shifted. As she stepped outside, the building behind her no longer represented a place of judgment or hierarchy, but a fully restructured environment defined by formal authority that had already been established through processes most residents only began to understand after it had been completed. Ethan remained inside, standing near the lobby entrance, no longer measuring status or position, but instead acknowledging quietly that the framework he once relied on had already been replaced. Olivia continued walking down the street, blending into the flow of the city, while behind her, the building stood unchanged in structure but entirely transformed in meaning, marking the final point where perception and reality had fully separated into two different understandings of the same place.
Before you leave, take a moment to think about Olivia's story. People often judge the others by neighborhood, clothes, or first impressions. But success doesn't always come with expensive suit, and kindness doesn't always come from those with the most money. The strongest people rarely waste their time to prove their worth. They let patience, character, and actions speak for them. Perhaps someone around you might be fighting a battle that you will never see, or building a future that no one could imagine. So next time you meet someone, choose respect before judgment, kindness before assumption, and humility before pride. Because one day, the person everyone overlooked may become the person that everyone admires. If you like this video, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Thank you for watching.